Ezequiel Ramos had not spoken to anyone in the village of San Cristobal del Monte in 11 days when he picked up the axe and went to the edge of the cornfield. He was not going for wood. He was going because the widow next door had been trying to drag the dried stalks to her house wall for 3 mornings running, and her daughter kept coughing, and the wind coming off the Coahuila Sierra had a quality he recognized, a specific cold pressure behind it, the kind that didn't announce itself until it arrived all at once. He had grown up in these mountains. He knew what that wind meant. Subscribe to Cuentos del Viejo Campo, and if you believe that quiet people sometimes do the most important things, ring the bell and stay with us. The widow's name was Remedios Garza. She was 34 years old and had been managing alone for 14 months, since her husband Candido died of a fall from a roof he had been paid to repair with materials that were not adequate for the job. She had a daughter named Esperanza, who was 7, and who had been born with lungs that did not cooperate with cold. The kind of condition that in a city would have a clinic and a prescription and a machine to help with the nights, but in San Cristobal del Monte meant that every winter Remedios counted the cords of wood, measured the gaps in the wall, and watched the sky with the particular attention of a woman who knows that cold is not an inconvenience for her child, but a genuine threat. The house had been her mother's. It sat at the edge of the village where the road turned toward the mountain, a small adobe structure with a peach tree in the yard that her mother, Concha, had planted 40 years ago, and that still produced every August with a stubbornness Remedios had always found appropriate. The walls were old, good adobe, 2 feet thick, which should have been enough, but there were gaps along the north base where 2 generations of weather had worked at the foundation, and it was through those gaps, in the worst January nights, that the cold came in low and settled on the floor where Esperanza slept. Remedios had seen the cornstalk technique in a memory so old she wasn't sure it was hers, something her mother had done when she was very small. She had started gathering the dried stalks from the field behind the house in early November, tying them in bundles, dragging them to the north wall and propping them at the base. It was slow work and her back hurt and Esperanza needed watching, and the work took 3 times as long as it should have. That was how Ezequiel found her on the 3rd morning. He didn't offer to help directly, because he was a man who had learned the hard way that offers can be refused, and refusals are a particular kind of loneliness. He simply picked up a bundle from the field edge and carried it to where she was working, and set it down and picked up another one. Remedios looked at him once. She did not say anything either. They worked in the specific silence of 2 people who understand each other through the mechanics of a shared task. By the end of the 1st morning, they had covered half the north wall. The routine established itself the way routines do between people who are both too tired for preamble. Ezequiel arrived at first light, when the cold was sharpest and the work was easiest to begin because there was no choice. He brought the bundles from the field in groups of 4, which was as many as he could carry without losing one. Remedios tied them and propped them, and packed the gaps with the smaller loose stalks that didn't bundle cleanly. Esperanza watched from the window for the first 2 mornings, and then came out in her coat on the 3rd, and Ezequiel handed her the smallest bundles to carry, which she did with the seriousness of a child who understands she has been given real work. Neither of them talked much, but the silence between them was a working silence, the kind that has tasks in it, which is different from the silence of 2 people who have nothing to say. On the 4th morning, Ezequiel brought coffee in a clay jug. He left it at the corner of the wall without comment. Remedios poured it into the 2 tin cups she'd brought out, and handed him one, and they drank standing up, looking at the work they had done, and she said, "It's better than I thought it would be." He said, "Your mother knew what she was doing." She looked at him. "Did you know my mother?" "No," he said. "But I know what the walls look like when someone has thought about them. She nodded. They went back to work. The peach tree stood in the yard bare and patient through all of it. Her mother had planted it the year Remedios was born, which made it 34 years old and still producing. In August, it had given more fruit than she could use, and she had given most of it away, which was the tree's habit. It did not produce for keeping. It produced for sharing, which Remedios had always thought was a personality trait rather than a horticultural fact. The ragdoll Esperanza, called Rebecca, watched from the windowsill through the morning work. She had placed it there herself, precisely, facing out. Remedios did not move it. The rosary on the kitchen shelf was her mother's, dark wooden beads worn smooth by 30 years of hands, with a small medal at the end that had a face so rubbed by handling that you could only tell it was a face by the shape. Remedios had not prayed the rosary in years, not since Candido died and the habit broke along with other things. But she picked it up sometimes while she was cooking, the way you pick up something familiar when your hands need something to do, and she felt the weight of all the fingers that had held it before hers. Ezequiel ate lunch at the corner of the property on the 4th day. He had not been invited, and he had not asked. And Remedios set out a plate for him, without discussing it. And he ate and said the beans were good, which was the longest compliment he had offered about anything since they began. Esperanza told him at length about Rebecca, her rag doll, and the specific illness Rebecca had suffered the previous winter, and her treatment plan, and the rag doll's recovery. Ezequiel listened with the complete attention that some quiet people give to children, the attention of someone who has learned to take seriously the things that are offered seriously. He asked one question about Rebecca's current health. Esperanza considered it and said she was doing much better since the cornstalks started going up. "The walls keep the cold out," said Ezequiel. "The cold is what makes her sick." "I know," said Esperanza. "That's why we're doing it." He looked at Remedios. She looked at the wall. "Yes," she said. "That's why." The village noticed within 2 days, in San Cristobal del Monte, where the houses were close and the windows faced each other, and the business of one family was the reference point of every other. 2 damaged people working quietly on something the village considered foolish was more interesting than almost anything else that had happened since the autumn market. Ezequiel had come to San Cristobal del Monte 3 years ago, not from choice, but from the particular displacement that happens when a life falls apart in one place, and there is nowhere better to go than somewhere quiet. His wife Pilar had died in childbirth, the child with her, and he had sold what he had in the city and come to the village where his mother's family had once lived and found the abandoned house at the far end of the road. 2 rooms, a leaking roof, a well that needed clearing, and he had fixed it up alone, one problem at a time, over the first 6 months. The village had watched and decided he was either simple or proud, and since neither quality invited conversation, they had left him more or less to himself. He had not minded. In those first years, being left alone was what he needed most, which is the cruelest irony of grief, that it makes you need exactly what it also makes you incapable of receiving. He worked the small plot behind the house. He kept to himself at the Saturday market. He was not rude. He was simply absent in the way that people still inside their grief are absent, present in body, and not quite there in any other way. Remedios had noticed him before the cornstalks. She had noticed him the way you notice someone at the periphery of your own trouble, as a reference point, a reminder that other people were also surviving things. She had not spoken to him before the morning he picked up the first bundle. She had thought he was cold. Not unfriendly, just very cold, in the way of someone who has been frozen for a long time and is not sure how to thaw without breaking something. She had been wrong and right at the same time, which was the most honest assessment she could make. Gabino Garza, the brother of Remedios' dead husband, had formed his own opinion of the situation before the second morning's work was done. Gabino ran what passed for a hardware concern at the village center and had been pursuing, with the patience of a man who is confident he will eventually win, the claim that the house Remedios occupied had belonged to Candido's family by right, and that Remedios, as a widow without male representation, had no legal standing to hold it. He had not yet put this in front of a notary, but the intention was known, and the village knew it the way they knew most intentions, through the particular quality of the silences in the conversations about it. "What are they building?" said Gabino's wife to her neighbor on the second day, looking at the north wall of Remedios' house. "Corn stalks," said the neighbor. "Against the wall, against the wall." Gabino's wife thought about this. Why? "She thinks it keeps the cold out." "The cold," said Gabino's wife. A silence. "And what does the man have to do with it?" Nobody had a direct answer for that, which meant they supplied indirect ones, which was how San Cristobal del Monte ran its speculation economy. By Thursday, the general position was that Remedios had lost her judgment since Candido died. Understandable. A woman in her situation, the child sick, the winter coming. You had to feel for her. And that Ezekiel, who had always been considered unreliable in the specific way of men who have suffered too much and withdrawn too far, was no kind of help to anyone. Don Prisciliano, who was 81 and had lived in the village longer than any wall standing in it, walked past the house one afternoon and looked at the work and said nothing. He came back the next morning and looked again. On the third morning he stopped at the gate. "Your mother did this," he said, to Remedios. Remedios stopped working. "I think so. I'm not sure I remember it right. She did it the winter of '79, said Don Prisciliano. "The year the cold killed the peach tree, and it came back anyway in the spring. She wrapped the whole north side." He looked at the work they had done, then at Ezekiel. "You're putting the angle wrong," he said. "They should lean outward, not flat. Water runs off." He demonstrated with one bundle, adjusting the angle with hands that were slow but precise. Then he walked back down the road without another word. Ezekiel looked at Remedios. She was already re-angling the bundles. They were working on the section nearest the foundation, the lowest course, where the gaps were worst, on a Thursday afternoon when Remedios' hand, pressing the bundle against the base, found something that wasn't adobe. She thought at first it was cloth, a rag stuffed into a gap, which was the old repair method when plaster wasn't available. But the cloth was deliberate, folded, protected inside a piece of oilskin that had kept it dry for a very long time, and when she worked it free and unfolded it, she was holding a letter. Her mother's handwriting. She knew it before she read a word, the particular backward lean of the capital letters, the way the periods pressed too hard into the page. "Ezekiel," said Remedios. And then nothing else. He came and crouched beside her, and she showed him the letter without explaining, and he waited while she read it. Her mother, Concha, had written it in the winter of 1991, when Remedios was a child. She had put it in the wall during a repair, in the way of someone who had something to say and wasn't sure of the other ways to say it. She wrote about the cornstalk method, its origins in her own grandmother's practice, 3 generations back. A technique from the mountain communities of Coahuila that had been keeping walls warm before anyone in the region had money for other solutions. She wrote the angle, the treatment, the depth, the specific instruction about the foundation course that their family's walls required. And then, in the second half of the letter, she wrote about the house. She had registered it in Remedios' name, not Candido's family's name, not a shared name, but Remedios Soledad Garza, her daughter, at the notary in the municipal seat in 1989, when Remedios was 12 years old, because she had known, in the way mothers sometimes know things they cannot explain, that her daughter would need it to be hers without condition. The folio number was in the letter, the notary's name, the date. Then Ezekiel saw something that made him reach past her and catch the corner of the oilskin before she set it down. There was a second piece of paper inside it, smaller, folded separately. A receipt from the municipal registry, dated 1989, with an official stamp. He put it in her hand without speaking. Remedios held both pages and looked at them for a moment. The cold came off the north wall, and the peach tree stood bare in the yard, and Esperanza's rag doll was propped in the window where she had left it that morning, watching the yard with button eyes. "My mother," said Remedios. "She did this 30 years ago, she knew," said Ezekiel. Remedios nodded slowly. Something settled in her face that had not been settled since the morning they told her about Candido. "Finish the corner," she said, "before the light goes." They finished the corner. Gabino Garza came on a Saturday, 3 days before the blizzard, with a man from the municipal seat who had a briefcase and the expression of someone performing a professional service he would prefer not to examine too closely. Gabino stood at the gate of the house with the manner of a man delivering an inevitable outcome. "The property," he said, "has been held informally. There are questions about the legal standing that need to be resolved before the winter makes everything more complicated. The property," said Remedios, "is registered at the municipal notary in my name. The folio number is 1147B, registered November 1989. The registering notary was Licenciato Fuentes." Gabino blinked. The man with the briefcase looked at his papers. "I can wait," said Remedios, "while you check." She was holding the rosary her mother had left on the kitchen shelf, small wooden beads worn smooth by 30 years of handling, which she had picked up without thinking when she heard the knock. She held it quietly, not performing anything, just holding it the way you hold something that has weight. Ezekiel was at the corner of the house. He did not move or speak. He did not need to. He was simply there, which was sometimes the only thing required. The man with the briefcase excused himself and walked 20 paces down the road. He stood with his back to them for several minutes. When he came back, his expression had changed to the specific neutrality of someone who has discovered that the situation is not what he was told. "The registration appears to be in order," he said to Gabino. Gabino looked at Remedios. She looked back at him with the steadiness of a woman who has been afraid for 14 months and is no longer afraid of this specific thing. "God willing," said Remedios, "we won't need to speak about this again." Gabino left. The man with the briefcase followed without looking at her. Ezekiel watched them go, and then went back to tying the last course of stalks along the west wall without commenting. Remedios went inside and put the rosary back on the shelf. The blizzard came on Tuesday. It came the way Ezekiel had known it would, all at once, without the courtesy of a gradual arrival, the way the worst things come when the signs have been there long enough that only the people paying attention are not surprised. By Tuesday evening the road was gone, under half a meter of snow. By Wednesday morning the temperature inside every thin-walled house in San Cristobal del Monte had dropped and kept dropping. And in the concrete block houses, which held cold the way stone holds cold, completely, evenly, without mercy, the families were burning wood at twice the rate they had planned and running short. Remedios's house held at 56 degrees inside on Tuesday night. She tracked it on the thermometer she had bought specifically at the October market, a practical purchase that Gabino's wife had mentioned with a particular half-smile reserved for things considered excessive. 56 degrees was not warm. But for Esperanza, whose lungs required only that the air not be actively hostile. It was enough. Esperanza slept through Tuesday night without coughing once. Remedios sat in the chair by the stove and listened to her daughter breathe normally in the next room. Steady, unlabored. The breathing of a child simply asleep and not fighting anything. And the relief of it was physical. She felt it in her chest and in her hands and in the back of her knees, and she stayed in the chair for a long time because she didn't trust herself to move without making noise, and the silence of Esperanza breathing well was the most important silence she had heard in months. She said, very quietly, to no one, and to God, and to her mother's rosary on the shelf, "Gracias." Ezekiel came through the connecting door at first light on Wednesday, with firewood stacked to his chin and the composed expression of a man who has found something useful to do with his hands. He set the wood by the stove and looked at Remedios, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything about what they were both thinking, which was that it had worked and the child was all right and they had done it. "Coffee," said Remedios. "Yes," said Ezekiel. Don Prisciliano arrived Wednesday afternoon with his granddaughter and a bag of masa, and he sat in Remedios's kitchen and drank his coffee, and after a long time he said, "Your mother was a woman who knew how to think ahead." "She was," said Remedios. "Most people aren't," said Don Prisciliano. "It's worth something." He looked at Ezekiel, who was stacking the extra firewood against the south wall with the methodical care he gave to all physical tasks. Don Prisciliano said nothing else about him, but he refilled his own coffee cup from the pot on the stove without asking, which in an 81-year-old man was the equivalent of a formal endorsement. By Thursday, 4 families had found their way to Remedios's house through the snow. Gabino Garza was not among them, but his wife was. She came alone on Thursday morning with 2 children and the composed expression of a woman who has decided not to explain herself. Remedios made room and made food and did not say a word about the corn stalks. She set an extra plate and poured more water into the beans, and that was all. When the snow cleared on Saturday and the families came out into the white transformed village and looked at the houses and at each other, the conversation was different from what it had been the week before. Not dramatically. No announcements, no apologies, no gathered acknowledgement. Just different. The way things are different when a fact has been established that cannot be argued with, and everyone knows it. And the best available option is to simply proceed with that knowledge in place. The children from the 4 families were still at Remedios's house Saturday morning, and they ate breakfast at the long table in the kitchen, the one her mother had built with a neighbor 30 years ago, wide enough to seat 10, which Remedios had never had 10 people to seat at before. And the sound of children eating and talking over each other filled the kitchen and went out through the walls and into the cold, clear air, and Remedios stood at the stove and listened to it the way you listen to something you have wanted for a long time, without letting yourself know you wanted it. Ezekiel was at the peach tree when she came out. He was clearing the snow from around its base with a care that was slightly more than the tree required. "It'll bloom in April," said Remedios. "My mother planted it the year I was born." "I know," said Ezekiel. "You told me." She paused. She hadn't told him. He had been paying attention to things she hadn't known she was saying. She stood beside him in the cold, clean morning, and neither of them said the other things yet. There was time, and the situation had not yet resolved into a form that required naming. But the peach tree was there, and the house was there, and inside the house Esperanza was laughing at something Don Prisciliano's granddaughter had said. The specific bright laugh of a child who has slept without coughing, and the ragdoll replica was back in the window facing out, and the rosary was on the shelf, and the letter was on the table in the kitchen in its oilskin wrapper. And all of these things were exactly where they were supposed to be. That was enough for one morning. More than enough. Because the door that opens through compassion, through one person picking up a bundle without being asked, through a letter placed in a wall 30 years before it was needed, through an old man correcting the angle of a stalk so the water runs off instead of soaking in, that door stays open. It becomes the door of the house. It becomes the thing that the house is known by. Did you ever find an unexpected door open when all the ones you knew had closed? If this story moved you, leave us a comment below. We read every one. Subscribe to Cuentos del Viejo Campo and share this with someone who is building something others don't understand yet. Until the next story, a heartfelt embrace, from heart to heart. And the peach tree at the edge of Remedios Garza's house blooms every April in San Cristobal del Monte, and people say that if you ask her about it, she will tell you what her mother knew, and what the walls have always known, and what a quiet man taught her about the particular courage of showing up.